This is Darwin to Jesus, and I hope you're all doing well. Today I'll be responding to Rationality Rules, also known as Stephen Woodford, on his video regarding William Paley's watchmaker argument. I want to respond to this video because it exemplifies many of the problems with how atheists go about addressing this argument, and I hope that viewers of this video will learn something about the actual argument that is being made, and the incredibly disingenuous way that it is typically responded to by nearly all atheists, even ones like Stephen here. So let's begin.
As most famously presented by William Paley in his theological work titled Natural Theology, the watchmaker analogy is a recurring argument for a designer, which, by way of analogy, asserts that complexity requires a designer.
And less than 30 seconds into the video, we immediately have a straw man. So if you read Paley's watchmaker argument, you'll see he is making an inference to the best explanation. He uses the word inference multiple times, and at no point does he say that complexity entails or must necessarily and only come about via a designer. Paley is making an argument where he appeals to evidence and inductive reasoning. In Paley's argument, he looks at a watch and deduces it appears designed because it is complex and seems to have a purpose, and these things indicate or imply a designer. Because it makes sense to infer that the watch has a watchmaker or a designer, and because the universe is complex and seems to be made for a purpose, we should think that the universe has a designer as well. This is Paley's actual argument. However, anytime you say anything about design to an atheist, the first thing they are likely to say is that this is the watchmaker fallacy. The watchmaker fallacy says that just because something is complex doesn't necessarily mean that it is designed. And this is indeed a fallacy if anyone actually said this, but I haven't heard anyone say this. I'm not saying it, and Paley certainly didn't say it. The design argument is, and always has been, an inference to the best explanation type of argument. In case anyone doesn't know what I mean by inference to the best explanation, let me give you a quick example. Imagine I walk into the living room and I look at my son, who looks uncomfortable, and I smell a hint of fecal matter. If we are to use inference to the best explanation, we would look at the situation and we would infer that it is likely that my son has pooped in his diaper. Inference to the best explanation does not mean that it is necessarily true and can only be the case that my son has pooped in his diaper. It just means that based on the available evidence that we are currently observing, it is likely that this is the best explanation, and what we should think, unless given new and more substantial information that indicates a different explanation, is the more likely candidate.
The way Paley put it is essentially as follows. If you were walking across a field and saw a watch lying upon the ground, you wouldn't assume that it had come together by chance because it is too ordered and complicated. Rather, you would assume that it had a conscious and intelligent designer. By way of analogy, Paley then went on to argue that because life, and indeed the universe, is ordered and complicated, it too must have had a conscious and intelligent designer. While Paley's presentation of this argument is the most famous, since his time many theists and deists have developed versions of their own. For example, Ray Comfort often uses the analogy of a painting and a painter, while Ian Duby is fond of using the analogy of a building and a builder. However, despite the many versions of this argument, they are all fundamentally the same. They assert that complexity requires a designer.
Complexity requires a designer? This is the problem. Atheists cannot help but strawman the design argument. Ray Comfort is saying that a building must have a builder in the same way that if we saw a person with 5 gunshot wounds in the back of their head, we would say that this person must have had a murderer. We would say that this person must have had a murderer because of the overwhelmingly significant type of evidence that we are looking at. We would not say that a person must have had a murderer if we see a small wound on the person's hand or something. Where the wound is, and the type of wound, and how many wounds are all incredibly relevant to how likely it is that a person has been murdered. It's not that just any wound on any place on the body necessarily means that we are looking at a murder. In the same way, we would not say that any type of complexity, no matter how insignificant, requires a designer. What we are saying is that when we see incredibly strong indications of complexity, such as what we see when we look at a watch, that is an incredibly strong indication of a designer. Just like if we walked into a living room and saw a house of cards, we would also think that a mind had put that house of cards together, and it was designed by a mind because of the high degree of specificity and order that is required to make a house of cards. In the same way, Paley is saying that because of the intricacy and the absurd amount of complexity of a watch and how all the different pieces are working together towards one end, that we must think that the watch is designed because that is by far the best explanation. But notice he's not saying that complexity entails a designer. This is a complete straw man, and at no point in his actual argument does he say this.
So what exactly is wrong with this argument? So, beginning with its most critical flaws, let's get on with it. First and foremost, and what single-handedly debunks the watchmaker argument, is that it's a false analogy. In this case, Paley insists that a comparison can be made between the complexity of a watch and the complexity of the universe, which both imply that they had a designer.
Did you catch that? He literally just said that complexity implies that these objects have a designer, not that complexity entails that these objects have a designer. So right here, he's literally admitting that Paley is not making an argument about how complexity necessarily entails a designer, but that it implies a designer. So he's admitted that his initial problem with this argument is a complete and total straw man. Entail and imply do not mean the same thing. And he's correct right here when he slips in the word imply, because that is exactly what Paley is actually arguing. That complexity implies a designer and not that it entails a designer. I have no doubt that Paley would admit that complexity can technically come about through a random process. A monkey typing on a keyboard can technically type out a page of Shakespeare. That's possible. But that's not the best explanation for what has happened if we see a monkey type a page of Shakespeare on a keyboard. If we saw this, we should think that the best explanation is that the monkey is intelligent, or something intelligent other than the monkey is responsible for this. But it's not that the best explanation is random chance.
However, the last step is flawed because it concludes that because two things share one quality in common, that being complexity, they must also share another quality in common, a designer, when this simply cannot be logically concluded. If it could, then by using the same faulty logic, countless other absurd qualities could be attributed to the universe. For example, the watch is complex, the watch was invented in the 15th century. The universe is complex, therefore the universe was invented in the 15th century. Just because two objects share one quality in common, this doesn't necessarily mean that they share another.
And here, Stephen is once again using the word necessarily rather than imply. But Paley never uses the word necessarily, and no one is arguing that complexity necessarily means a designer. William Paley's argument is an argument that is made about the inference to the best explanation. And the best explanation for something that is incredibly complex and intricate and appears goal-driven is that it had a designer, which we can deduce using obvious reasoning. When Stephen says that the analogy is faulty because the phenomena can be associated with something like the year the watch was made, and it's therefore arbitrary to say complexity indicates design because correlation is not causation, this would be like me looking at a person with 5 bullets in the back of their head and saying, there must be a murderer. And then Stephen says, well, correlation is not causation, Daniel. Just because the last person who had 5 bullets in the back of their head was murdered doesn't mean this person here is murdered. The last person with 5 bullets in their head also had a Honda, so we may as well think this person had a Honda. The problem with this rebuttal is that Stephen is acting like we are just arbitrarily saying that complexity means a designer for no reason except that there is a correlation between the two. However, we actually have good reason to believe that complexity means that a designer is likely. because things like complexity and beauty and specificity and order are all things that indicate mindful intentionality. Think of a small stack of rocks or the picture hanging on your wall. These things require a person to be deliberate and put the item exactly where it is supposed to be in order to get the desired result. Intentionality does not entail a mind. So if we have strong indicators of intentionality through design inferences, then we should think the best explanation is design. In other words, we have a reason that is not simply correlation for why things like complexity, order, and information are very strong indicators of a designer. Furthermore, if Stephen is really going to say that we cannot make an argument about design because correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation, then he has just thrown all science and causality and evolution right out the window. Everything in science assumes that correlation and causation are linked and that we can indeed make reasonable conclusions based on correlation. For example, in evolution, there seems to be a correlation between an animal's environment and what an animal is suited for, and this is considered strong evidence in favor of evolution. However, if we are to take Stephen's logic here that correlation does not equal causation, and we can't make logical inferences, then this observation remains nothing but an observation, and we should conclude nothing. And this goes for everything in science. But Stephen loves science. He appeals to science, and he would not be making this type of ridiculous argument of correlation does not equal causation about an inference to the best explanation when it comes to any of his favored theories. And that means that Stephen is special pleading, and he's simply being inconsistent in applying this critique only to something when he doesn't want it to be true. Stephen is special pleading and only applying this critique to arguments that aren't in his worldview.
Hence, right from the get-go, the watchmaker argument is a false analogy. A second objection, and one very closely related to the first, is that it commits a false cause fallacy. It does this by asserting that complexity and order can only be caused by a designer, when not only has this never been proven to be true, it has actually been proven to be completely incorrect. But we'll get to evolution in just a second. Essentially, like all false cause fallacies, the watchmaker argument mistakenly confuses correlation with causation. It recognises a relationship between complexity and designers, and then concludes that one necessarily implies the other. To once again demonstrate this flaw through an unrelated example, we can take a look at the following. Temperatures have been rising over the past few centuries, whilst at the same time the number of pirates have been decreasing. Thus, pirates call the world and global warming is a hoax. There may be a correlation between temperatures and pirates, just as there is a correlation between complexity and designers, but this doesn't necessarily mean that one implies the other.
Here Stephen says that the watchmaker argument necessarily implies that complexity requires a designer. I think Stephen is throwing the word necessary out in order to confuse us again. But notice he is agreeing that design is implied based on the argument, not entailed. So we should focus on the word imply. The word imply means to suggest or indicate something else. For example, if I come home and smell food, that implies that my wife has made me dinner. However, it does not necessarily entail that she has made me dinner. It could be she forgot to make me food, or she may have made dinner but overcooked it and now it's no good. Or perhaps I thought I smelled dinner, but really it was a late lunch and the food has already been eaten. There are other possibilities. However, despite the fact that there are other possibilities, the most logical and reasonable inference when I come home and smell food is that my wife is making or has made dinner. So I hope you can see that Stephen is still arguing against the total straw man, and he has yet to deal with the actual argument, which is an inference to the best explanation, not an argument that complexity necessarily entails design and cannot possibly come about in any other way.
And this brings us comfortably to yet another major problem with the watchmaker argument. It completely ignores evolution by natural selection. Without getting into it too deeply, Natural selection has been completely and utterly proven to be an unconscious process that has given rise to countless complex and purposed organisms, which, without an understanding of natural selection, do indeed give the impression that they were deliberately designed. Or in other words, we know for a fact that nature can, does, and has produced remarkably complex organisms without a conscious and intelligent hand behind it.
Actually, Stephen, you don't know what you're talking about at all, because science does not deal with proofs or facts. Science is in the business of making inferences to the best explanation. When we use science to learn about the world and study things like evolution, we're working in the realm of theories, aka the best explanations. And currently, in science, evolution is thought to be the best explanation for the diversity of life. But it is certainly not, and never has been, and never will be, and cannot ever be, a fact. So you simply are completely ignorant about what science does or how it works. Furthermore, not only is evolution not a fact at all, whatsoever, in any way, shape, or form, but this argument doesn't even make sense, because it assumes that just because we don't see a mind that has guided evolution, therefore, we should think that mindless natural processes can lead to incredibly complex and intricate organisms like life. But this is very silly, actually. Let me explain why. Let's say that we watch natural processes like wind and waves and earthquakes, all of these things. Somehow they move different pieces of matter around and shape them, and they bring them all together, and a spaceship is created. And the spaceship then flies off the Earth and travels to Mars. In this scenario, we only saw natural processes doing this. We haven't directly seen a mind do it. But is the logical inference, if we were to see this, to infer that the spaceship was able to come about through mindless natural processes? Or should we infer, because of the insanely high amount of intricacy, complexity, information, and specificity that would be required for a spaceship to exist, that this spaceship was designed even though we don't actually see a mind that has designed it? In other words, the spaceship itself is the evidence that a mind is responsible because of how strongly a spaceship indicates design. In the same way, life is so indicative of design that even if I grant that we don't technically see a mind that is responsible and we appear to have a naturalistic explanation for how we are here, design is still the best explanation. Just to drive the point home, let's say that a deck of cards slips out of my hand, and as the cards fall to the ground, they somehow organize and fall into a design where each card is exactly where it needs to be in order to become a literal house of cards. Can I say that natural causes may be responsible for this? Yes. But is that the best explanation for this phenomena? Absolutely not. The best explanation would be to say that there's somehow a mind involved even though we cannot see one. In the same way, life is far more complex than a house of cards, and so it is more ridiculous to think that life arose through mindless natural processes because of how obviously designed it is. So not only does Stephen have no understanding of what science is, or how science works, or what a fact is, or what a theory is, he also has no understanding of how design works, and how if something clearly appears designed and has insanely high amounts of order and complexity and indicators of design, the best explanation is always going to be a mind, even if we can't see one. And I'm going to say one more thing about this to really drive the point home. We have absolutely no idea if the natural processes or if the laws of nature are designed or not. If God is responsible for everything, then the universe itself is designed, and everything in it is also designed. This means that if we see laws of nature bringing about order and complexity, that observation in and of itself indicates that a mind is responsible because order and complexity indicate a designer. So natural laws that create incredible stableness and intelligibility and other indicators of design do indicate that a designer was responsible for these laws. This means that Stephen is begging the question by assuming that if a natural law does something, then therefore it's not designed because Stephen doesn't know if a mind is behind the natural laws or not. He's simply assuming no mind is behind them and dismissing all the evidence to the contrary as a form of absurd cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias. What I mean is that atheists assume, with no justification, that the laws of physics and nature don't come from a mind, and then they look at all the order and complexity and beauty that results from them and say, see, a mindless thing can do this. But imagine if I assumed that my daughter had no mind, that she was really as smart as a rock, and then anytime I see her reading or drawing or stacking Legos, I say, look, see, rocks can do this intelligent type stuff too. Do you see the problem? I've assumed a priori, or before, that I have a conclusion, and now everything after that I see, no matter how intelligent my daughter acts, will only confirm that rocks can also mindlessly be intelligent somehow. This is exactly what the atheists are doing. They assume that the laws of nature are mindless, and there is no mind responsible for them, and then when they see the laws of nature bringing about tremendous order, complexity, and beauty, they say, see, mindless laws of nature can also bring about these things that look clearly designed.
The truth of the matter is that the reason we recognise a watch as designed actually has nothing to do with how complex and purposed it is, but rather it is because we already know that the watch was designed.
Now it's really getting difficult to take this argument seriously because Stephen is literally not dealing with Paley's argument whatsoever. Because if you actually read Paley's argument, he specifically talks about this point that Stephen is trying to make. And he says that even if we had never seen a watch designed, we would still think, if we investigated it, that the watch was designed because of its specificity, because of its complexity, because of its order, and because of its goal-driven nature. So Stephen is now completely off the rails and not dealing with what Paley has said, and it seems like either Stephen didn't read the argument, and it's only 8 pages, or Stephen is purposefully not addressing Paley's argument because he literally cannot deal with what it says, and he is counting on the fact that most atheists are completely ignorant to Paley's actual argument, and hoping that we will just not read the argument for ourselves, because if we did read the argument for ourselves, we would know that this is literally addressed within the argument. Just in case anybody thinks that I am making this up, I will quote Paley himself where he addresses this in his argument. Paley says, "Nor would it, I apprehend, weaken the conclusion that we had never seen a watch made." So in other words, even if we had never seen a watch made, it wouldn't weaken the conclusion. That we had never known an artist capable of making one. That we were altogether incapable of executing such a piece of workmanship ourselves, or of understanding in what manner it was performed. All this being no more than what is true of some exquisite remains of ancient art, or of some lost arts, and, to the generality of mankind, of the more curious productions of modern manufacture. So he's saying that this is all true of things that we discover that are ancient, and it's also true of modern things that are made, and we aren't familiar with them because they're new. He's saying we can still tell that these things are designed. He continues, does one man in a million know how oval frames are turned? So oval frames, if you don't know what those are, I'll put a picture here. And he says, ignorance of this kind exalts our opinion of the unseen and unknown artist's skill, if he be unseen and unknown, but raises no doubt in our minds of the existence and agency of such an artist at some former time and in some place or other. So in other words, we can tell that it's designed, even though we don't know who designed it or how it was designed, we can still tell that it was designed. So when Stephen says that all the watches, we know how they're made, that's totally irrelevant. We can tell that things are designed, whether we know how they're made, whether we've seen them be made or not. Paley finishes, nor can I perceive that it varies at all the inference whether the question arises concerning a human agent or concerning an agent of a different species, or an agent possessing, in some respects, a different nature. So in other words, it could be human or something else. It doesn't really matter. It's something with a mind, because we can spot design because of the indicators. So that's the end of Paley's quote. And in other words, Paley is saying that we don't need to have seen a watch made in order to infer that the watch was designed. Note that he does use the word inference here, because he is making an argument about the inference to the best explanation, like I've been saying this entire time. So Stephen is completely sidestepping this part of the argument, and he's continuing to strawman Paley. I think this about wraps it up for part 1 of this response, so I will end this here and I'll continue on in part 2 where I will be responding to the rest of Stephen's video. So thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, leave a like, and comment below to tell me what you think. Have a wonderful day, and God bless.